By 1859, John Brown had planned a truly audacious attack. His carefully chosen target, a small town in Virginia, Harper's Ferry. Flowing gently through the pastoral Blue Ridge Mountains, the Shenandoah River winds its way into the Potomac that separates Maryland to the north from Harper's Ferry, Virginia, and marks the site of John Brown's raid.
Harper's Ferry is a remote town of some 2,000 right at the confluence of the Shenandoah and Potomac rivers with a hill right in back of it. It is as remote a place as one could likely find.
Brown selected Virginia for the site of his raid for a couple of reasons. One, it was close, he thought, to large populations of slaves who would rise up and help him in his revolt. Two, he was at the junction of the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers, and he could then go down the Shenandoah Valley, spreading his revolt throughout plantations, through Virginia, and into the South.
Harper's Ferry was the home of the United States Army and arsenal, and the weapons stored here could outfit an army. Brown hoped to capture these weapons and use them to wage a war on slavery and begin a new country in the mountains above Virginia.
Brown had an advanced scout here in Virginia prior to his raid. John Cook arrived here almost 1 year in advance of the attack on the armory. Cook worked as a lock tender on the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal opposite Harper's Ferry, and he scouted the area, sensing the terrain. He rode around the neighborhood. He understood when people came to work. He knew where the buildings were. He knew how many watchmen there were, and he also knew where the estates were and where the slaves were located.
By the summer of 1859, Brown is ready to attack. With some of his sons, he turns up in the Harper's Ferry vicinity himself, and he rents a farmhouse on the Maryland side of the Potomac River from a family by the name of the Kennedys. He gives his name as a Mr. Smith. He says, "I'm a cattle buyer from New York." By this time, he's grown a flowing white Old Testament beard. It's a disguise, so he won't be associated with the Potawatomi massacre in Kansas.
He had pikes made, mounted on long staffs, large bladed Bowie-type blades, which could be used by untrained slaves not used to firearms.
In the year 1857, I made a contract with John Brown to make 1,000 pikes, which he said were to be used by the settlers in Kansas to protect themselves from intrusions by the so-called border ruffians. Chet Blair, 1889.
But Brown's true plans for the crude spears lay far from Kansas.
Brown realized that slaves had little experience with weapons. For a slave to have a weapon in his hand could be a capital offense. So Brown knew that he had to provide a means of defense for the slave that would provide him with that defense until he could learn how to use the sophisticated weapons of the time.
His arsenal would also include powerful and accurate Sharps rifles. Some were brought with him from Kansas, but he hoped that more would arrive along with his army.
And so it will be all summer into the fall that John Brown waits for men and arms to come to the site in Maryland. He has his daughter Annie and his daughter-in-law Martha come down to join them, and they are the watching eyes to protect Brown and a possible discovery of Brown and what he intends to do.
I was there to keep the outside world from discovering that John Brown and his men were in the neighborhood. I used to help Martha with the cooking all she would let me. Father would often tell me that I must not let any work interfere with my constant watchfulness. He depended on me to watch. Annie Brown.
He had 21 followers, most of them young, 5 of them black. Among the blacks was a 48-year-old former slave, Dangerfield Newby, who had been freed by his master and had to leave Virginia because it was against the law for a free black to stay there. He had to leave his wife and 6 or 7 children in slavery. He now joined up with John Brown in hopes of liberating his family in slavery.
That summer of 1859, another Sabbath passed quietly at Harper's Ferry. The huge volunteer force Brown waited for at Kennedy Farm had just not arrived. Still, his darkness came. The long period of inactivity would give way to climax.
Shortly before midnight on October the 16th, Brown determined that the time is right. He will gather his men and say to them, "Get on your arms, we shall proceed to the ferry."
They descend down the mountain road from the Kennedy farmhouse. Harper's Ferry comes into view just across the river. It's a twinkling fairy tale city, quiet, remote, not a single inhabitant there had any idea about how history was suddenly to explode in their very midst.
Brown and his Provisional Army traveled the 6 miles from the Kennedy Farm to the Potomac River crossing.
There they make their way across on foot on an old railroad bridge. And as they approach the railroad station, someone walks out to see who they are. A voice calls out in the night. Someone says, "Halt." The silence is broken by a rifle shot. A body thuds to the ground.
Ironically, the first man killed in Brown's raid was a free black man, a baggage master named Haywood Shepard.
During the night, several of Brown's men fanned out into the estate area west of Harper's Ferry toward Charlestown, specifically to seize several estate owners, primarily Colonel Lewis Washington, the great-grandnephew of George Washington.
Hostages taken, John Brown's men continue to their primary target.
They come sneaking across the railroad bridge over the Potomac. They dash across the intersection to the government armory and arsenal. There's a night watchman on duty. This poor guy has no idea what is happening to him. Suddenly, he's surrounded by armed men with guns, and he's confronted by this man with blazing eyes and a flowing white beard.
I came here from Kansas, and this is a slave state. I have possession now of the United States Armory, and if the citizens interfere with me, I must only burn the town and have blood. John Brown.
The first part of the plan had succeeded brilliantly. What Brown didn't count on was that the alarm would go out to the townspeople and that they would react defensively. Brown had expected no opposition whatever from the townspeople. Instead, what happened was that very quickly they began to besiege Brown. Shots ring out.
The outlaw chief had by this time perceived that instead of hundreds of allies, he was hemmed in by thousands of infuriated enemies. He retired into the fire engine house within the public grounds. When they next appeared in the street, one of the outlaws was shot down. D.H. Strother, journalist, 1859.
The dead man was former slave Dangerfield Newby.
He is shot through the neck with an iron spike from one of the guns of the townspeople, and his body is hauled off where he's mutilated, and later his body is fed to hogs in a local alley.
Once the siege starts, the scene inside the fire engine house where Brown and his men are holed up quickly becomes something of a bedlam. They can't see out very well. They don't know what's going on around them. When they do fire out, the brick walls in this very confined small building, only about 30 feet square, echo tremendously with the sound of the loud reports of these weapons.
Brown expected that the slaves in the plantations nearby in Virginia would come to his aid, take the pikes and weapons that he'd acquired, and help him succeed in this revolt. And so when the time came, Brown's help did not materialize.
Willie Lehman, a 19-year-old raider, realized that things weren't going well and decided to escape. So he scurried down the armory wall, ended in the river, began swimming north toward Maryland in an effort to get away from the militia and the town citizen. He became exhausted.
Under fire from 20 militiamen, Lehman crept to a rock in the Potomac and became the next raider to die.
Since this is an attack on a United States installation, the president, Buchanan, calls in U.S. troops. The nearest troops available were in Washington, the Marines at the Washington Naval Yard. They were brought to Harper's Ferry via train, and their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee, was also brought to Harper's Ferry.
Lee realizes when he gets to Harper's Ferry, it's too late to do anything that day, so he's going to wait till the next morning, and his troops are going to storm the engine house itself.
During that terrible night, Brown paced the engine house, surveying the scene. His son Watson had been shot that day, and he laid beside his dying brother Oliver.
When the sun comes up, Brown sees that he's no longer facing just some farmers and some townspeople, but he's facing men in the blue uniform of the United States Marines. And sooner or later, he comes to know that he's also facing Colonel Robert E. Lee.
If they will peaceably surrender themselves and restore the pillaged property, they shall be kept in safety to await the orders of the President. Colonel Lee represents to them in all frankness that the armory is surrounded on all sides by troops, and that if he is compelled to take them by force, he cannot answer for their safety. R.E. Lee, Colonel, commanding United States troops.
Colonel Lee brought with him as his aide Lieutenant J.E.B. Jeb Stuart. Stuart went before the engine house doors and there began to discuss terms with Brown. Brown refused to negotiate, and with that, Stuart backed away from the door, waved his hat in the air, and gave the Marines the signal to attack.
Brown felt the pulse of his dying son with one hand and held his rifle with the other, and commanded his men with utmost composure to be firm and sell their lives as dearly as they could. Colonel Lewis Washington, hostage, 1859.
The Marines break the door down, charge inside, go after the other raiders. Lieutenant Israel Green goes after John Brown. Brown's about to shoot him with a gun. Green comes after Brown with his sword, stabs forward with it, and hits Brown in the belt buckle. The sword doubles.
The entire attack, once the doors of the engine house have been penetrated, will take 3 minutes. At the end of that 3 minutes, all the hostages are freed unharmed. All of Brown's men have been captured.
Errors that make even the best